Hello and welcome to the Evolution of Medicine podcast. I'm your host, James Maskell, and I am here with a big fan of her work. It's Lynne McTaggart. Welcome, Lynne.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, James.
So if you don't know about Lynne's work, she's the publisher of What Doctors Don't Tell You. She's a writer, an author, and has been a leader in this field for a long time. And she has a new book coming out that we're going to talk about shortly. But while I've got you here, Lynne, I do have to talk about sort of like this, doctor in the house. Dr. Rangan Chatterjee is a big friend of ours here at the Evolution of Medicine. His show, prime time, BBC One, showcasing the possibility of lifestyle and functional medicine to reverse chronic disease. It must be an exciting time to be in your corner in the UK at this moment.
Well, it's so exciting because just a few years ago, we had a skeptical society trying to ban us. Our publication, What Doctors Don't Tell You. Now, we are simply providing evidence for functional medicine, essentially. And so we had that kind of attitude really trying to attack and bring down. And now we're starting to see just a very timid, but nevertheless acknowledgement of this by the mainstream establishment. And to see this on BBC just absolutely warms the cockles of my heart, because it starts saying that these ideas are permeating the mainstream and that people are tired of the old way with medicine, the old sickness model and the old exclusive drugs-based model. So they're getting, the public is voting with their feet, and finally the establishment is catching on.
It's beautiful. The first thing we ever said on the Functional Forum was we got to start acting like we're winning, stop acting like we're losing. And I feel like there's this moment here where people see people reversing these chronic diseases on TV and go, their ideas about what is possible just expanded. And it's really exciting because then that's a starting point to have a real conversation. So, well, look, I'm glad that you're on the front lines. You've got the magazine. I'm really excited to see how this is all going to come together. But, more than anything, Lynne, I am absolutely thrilled to talk about your new book, because when I saw the name of it, the first thing that I did was order a copy for everyone in my work team, because we actually have a team of 8 people at the Evolution of Medicine at this moment. And so I saw it, I sent it to my partner, and so the whole team's reading it and we're going through it. But why don't you just start with where this all started? I know the last book was The Intention Experiment. Now you're talking about the power of 8. How do you go from one to the other?
Well, let me backtrack a little bit and explain why I wanted to do the intention experiment and how that led into this. I was fascinated by, when I finished my book, The Field, where I really wrote about the revolution in science that is happening with many, many frontier scientists discovering that we're part of a giant energy field, that we're very different biologically than we thought we were. And one of the things that came about and came up again and again in their studies, very well controlled and designed studies, and these were very prestigious scientists at prestigious universities, was the idea that thoughts are an actual something with the capacity to change physical matter. So I thought to myself, well, okay, well, what does that mean? Now, I have a background as an investigative reporter. That's how I started out life. And so I don't really like woo-woo very much. I mean, I don't like unproven woo-woo. I certainly go to the line between science and spirituality. I like investigating alternative medicine, but I also like proof. So when I heard about all of this stuff about the law of attraction and The Secret, I kept thinking to myself, okay, now let's say this is as powerful as they say it is. Why are people just manifesting parking spaces and more stuff for themselves? Why aren't we curing cancer with our thoughts? And also, how far can we take this, and does it magnify if lots of people, more than one person, is thinking the same thought at the same time? So I decided to test it to the limit. Being somebody with a scientific bent, somebody who likes science writing and likes to see proof and facts, I figured, well, I know a lot of scientists in consciousness research, working at places like Princeton and Penn State, etc. And I have loads of readers around the world. My book was in 30 languages by that time. So I thought if I put them together, I'll have the largest global laboratory in the world. So I did that. And I decided to test the power of intention with well-controlled studies. So we had, every so often, one of the scientists would set up something in the laboratory, seeing if, say, we could make seeds grow faster with our thoughts, or change pH of water. And then I would invite my internet audience or an actual audience, if I was speaking somewhere, to send intention to this well-controlled target. Scientists wouldn't know which thing we'd sent intention to. Let's say we had 4 possibilities. We would do it, say in the case of seeds, there'd be 4 sets of seeds. We would choose a set. Scientists wouldn't know which ones we were sending intention to. They would plant the seeds and afterward measure them. And for instance, with the seed experiment, we ran that 6 times. And every single time, with then 6 more controlled experiments. And every single time we sent intention, the seeds grew significantly higher than controls. And of these experiments, which were, as I say, very simple and got more complex over time, even trying to lower violence in war-torn areas and heal someone of PTSD, of 30 experiments, 26 showed significant, mostly significant, positive, mostly significant responses. Now, as you guys know, there's probably no drug out there that can claim that kind of positive and consistent effect. So I was really fascinated by this and shocked because I wasn't really sure this was going to work. And it was very strange because in a lot of cases, we were sending intention remotely, really remotely. I mean, in one case with the seed experiment, I was speaking before a group in Sydney, Australia. We were sending intention to seeds that were in the University of Arizona's lab in Tucson, Arizona, 8,000 miles away. And also, we were sending intention to a picture of the seeds, a photo of the seeds, not the thing itself, but just a representation of the thing. So that made some big, big suggestions about consciousness, and maybe even the idea that we have a psychic internet. So as I was playing around with these experiments and trying to learn some things about them, and having my own skepticism overthrown, I thought at the time, and this was about 2008, I ought to run a workshop on this. But I was a journalist with a journalist's background, and I wasn't a personal development trainer, nor had it much desire to be that. So I wasn't really sure what to do. So I thought to myself, how do we show the power of intention in a workshop? Well, maybe I'll put people into groups of 8, I said to my husband, and we'll just have them send a healing thought to one of the members of the group with a health problem. And my husband said, yeah, the power of 8, I like that. And so we did our first workshop. We put people in groups of 8. I'm making it up as I go along. I'm saying, no, all hold hands, all send the same intention, and this is what you have to do, etc. And come back tomorrow for the next day of the workshop and tell us how it was. And I assumed it would be a nice little feel-good exercise, like a facial. People came back the next day, they lined up with a microphone, and one by one said things like this. I had migraines for my whole life, and they're gone. I had IBS and my stomach feels fine today. I've had IBS for years. Oh, I have arthritis and I'm in constant pain. My pain is gone. I've had, and on and on and on, it went for about an hour. Well, I was shocked, and I also hated this because I was trying to prove intention on a very scientific basis. And all of a sudden, the biggest woo-woo of all is occurring right in front of me. So I decided to tell nobody about this, and this is why it's taken me nearly 10 years to come public with the story. But I kept doing this in workshops, and everywhere I ran, in every workshop I did, whenever I put people in small groups of about 8, there would be, and had them do this kind of healing intention, all the same intention for someone. Mostly the receivers, even sometimes the senders, had these amazing transformational healings. I mean, we had a woman with MS who showed up without her crutches the next day. We had a woman who had really bad arthritis and was walking normally the next day. Woman with scoliosis, whose back was so straight, she wrote me after the event, her back straightened up a bit. She sent me a note saying she had to change the rear view mirror in her car. And, on and on and on and on and on.
It's really amazing. Such a great story. One of my favorite quotes on this kind of topic, I went to see Russell Brand a couple of years ago, and he says, for people who doubt that there's some sort of, connection like that, he says, my cat doesn't know there's the internet, but there is the internet. And I always thought that was so good. It's like, you can't see. I thought that was a great quote. But yeah, it speaks to what you're exactly saying, right?
Well, there are so many factors in healing, and this is the really important point that the conventional medical view doesn't acknowledge, which is there is that relationship between people that becomes a healing mechanism. And there are healing mechanisms we don't completely understand. After this happened, James, being the reporter I am, I was desperate to find out why. So I started investigating why this. Surely somebody must have come up with this before me. I knew there were plenty of prayer groups before, but I tried to find some antecedents in esoteric, practices and indigenous practices and religious areas, etc. And it was fascinating. There are some interesting aspects to that. I mean, whatever your religion, it's very interesting to see there was a mistranslation in the Bible, in the Acts, which is the part of where the apostles were being told by Jesus, after he ascended. They were trying to follow his instructions for setting the church up and doing their healings and their prayer together. And one thing that he had constantly said was pray, well, the way it's translated in the King James Version, it's with one accord, which is a very anemic way of saying what was the original Hellenic Greek, which was a word called humathumedon, which is an adverb that's a musical term that's much more like passionate unity. Think of a Beethoven symphony with lots of individual instruments playing passionately with one voice. Well, that was essentially what he was saying, is pray passionately together. And apparently, from what the Acts say, the apostles, if they are to be believed, the apostles had their healing successes when they prayed passionately with one voice. So I was fascinated by that, but I looked at lots of different ways of why this works. Everything from the power of altruism and how that affects the vagus nerve of the body,
yep.
the love nerve of the body, and how that activates the immune system, to also the power of group and what happens with group, a collective effervescence, as Emile Durkheim once called it, to just what happens with brainwaves. And we actually did a study of Power of Eight groups, because I was, again, wondering, why is this so successful? And Life University, the largest chiropractic school in the world, a university in the world, offered to give me their psychology department, essentially, and put it at my disposal. And so we ran a series. Our first series of studies were about brainwaves of people who were novice participants in these Power of Eight groups. And they found extraordinary brain changes. They found a quieting, a global quieting of the brain, but particularly the parietal lobes, the part of the brain that says, you guys all know this, where you end and the rest of the world begins. And also the executive portions of the brain, the frontal lobes, particularly the areas involved with worry and doubt and negativity. And this was an identical brainwave signature to the work of a Dr. Andrew Newberg, who did studies of Sufi masters, Buddhist monks in ecstatic prayer, people, in these transformational states who experienced a mystical state. So this was also fascinating to me, because it suggests that there is something about this little group effect that can be essentially like a mystical experience. It's like a fast track to the miraculous. And what makes it so interesting to me is that you don't need hours and years of practice to do this as you do as a Sufi master. You don't need hours of priming to get into that state as you do if you're a Buddhist monk in prayer. You don't need ayahuasca, you don't need a sweat lodge, you don't need anything. You just need a little group, all essentially praying together. Praying and tending is really just a more secular version and specific version of prayer. So I think this has enormous application for all kinds of groups, including doctors.
Yeah, amazing. Well, one of the things that makes me think of is the blue zones, right? Where you have these groups of places which have, significant longevity. We don't really know why, but we know there's a really strong sense of community. The closest one here today is the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, which is just up the road from where I live. And you see, it's not just everyone in Loma Linda, because I've been to Loma Linda and I've seen the McDonald's there, right? It's the Seventh-day Adventists, and they pray together, and they fast, and they walk, and they do other things that are healthy together. It seems like, we may never understand the mechanism, or it may take us a long time to get there, but like the results are real and happening all around us.
Well, I think you've just hit on something really important, really central. And I looked at this a lot in both The Power of Eight and my last book, The Bond. The whole idea of community, there's two elements here. There's community and there's altruism. And both act like a bulletproof vest when it comes to health. I mean, community, I was really fascinated by a study by some epidemiologists who were looking at why Japanese transplants to the US, some of them get heart disease and some of them don't. I mean, the Japanese are really fascinating because many of them smoke like chimneys, people back in Japan, but they don't have heart disease, not like the US. And so when epidemiologists look at this, they say, well, they don't until they move to the States, and then some do and some don't. So there was a study of this looking into it, and they found, so interesting, diet made no difference. Didn't matter whether or not they had Big Macs or tofu and sushi in terms of health and longevity. What mattered the most was whether or not they had recreated the old ties and had a strong and interconnected community. And when you look at studies of longevity, community comes up again and again and again in poor neighborhoods in America, Mexican and other kind of Latino communities. Community is a powerful aspect of it. Really, really, in many ways, one of the most powerful. Now, I'm not going to argue with you against good diet. I'm totally on the page for good diet, supplements, exercise, etc. But community is that area that is so often overlooked in our very isolated lives. And that was one of the exciting things about a small group, because the other thing that I decided to do to test this, James, was to create my own Petri dish. So I set up, I asked for some volunteers, and I got 250, and I set them up for a year. I had 7 teleseminars with them, and then put them in groups of 8 and had them meet every week for a year and work on intending for each other. And of those 250, 150 carried on meeting religiously week after week after week. And I also monitored them every month, looking at their physical health and mental health, their relationships, their jobs and how they were going, and whether they were changing jobs in any way, and their life's purpose. And pretty much 100% of the people who continued to meet regularly in groups had major transformations. I mean, in terms of health, we had a woman with chronic fatigue for 15 years. She could barely exercise for 5 minutes. She's now hiking. We had a woman who had vitiligo, who started repigmenting. We had a woman who regained most of her hearing. She had real problems with hearing. We had a guy who overcame, he was a clinical psychologist who had tried everything. And he overcame essentially lifelong depression. I mean, here's a guy who used every alternative thing in the book. And then we had people, changing jobs and careers, finding dream jobs, setting up businesses they'd always wanted to set up. And, I was fascinated. And, life purpose changing, relationships improving, relationships with estranged family members healed. I was so fascinated by this. And again, wanted to try to find the X factor here. And a number of my people said it. First of all, in most cases, they never physically met. They met every week on the internet, on Skype or Google Hangouts or Zoom. They never physically met, but they did these intentions together, and they became like intention families. And they, as one said, it's amazing having a group of strangers essentially praying for you. It's like that never happens. And you never have this kind of group that give you this kind of unconditional caring and connection and support, and that is so powerful. It's so strengthening. It's so healing. And also many of them talked about the idea. One of them said, I'd approach every meeting like a naughty child, not wanting to settle down, being skeptical of the whole thing. And then I'd get together and start intending with the group, and it would be like a soup that slowly changed my brain. And I loved that because it was that kind of feeling where you suddenly meld into this larger entity. And I think that's, I don't totally understand it, James, but I think that's part of it. The group is an X factor. The support of knowing the group's got your back is so, so powerful.
Can I ask you about the number 8? Because, we've certainly done some experiments. I mean, if you look at something like the Saddleback Church, right, with Mark Hyman and the pastors there, where they put, they've got these groups of 5. They got these mainly groups of 5 on a Wednesday night, the Bible study, and they lost £250,000 between 15,000 of them because of this, this small group community. Like in our own company, we've got doctors, and we've got doctors who are trying to build these practices of the future, and we've been putting them in groups of 5, and every week they get together and sort of hold each other accountable to their own individual goals. We've got these groups, other meetups, other things, in the group visits. Dr. Shilpa Saxena prefers like 16 people in a group because she feels like there's this real power of peer-to-peer medicine that's delivered. Terry Walls, reversing MS at scale, loves the group as well and gets everyone involved and has her thing. She prefers like 8 to 10. So I was just wondering, is there something about the 8 that stood out? Because I see that there is a power of these groups in all these different ways. I'm absolutely convinced that community is a really important tool. In fact, Dr. Kelly Brogan on the last Functional Forum spoke about her shift from being in clinical practice one-on-one to doing this group program and seeing better results and incredible results with mental health in the group program. And she's absolutely convinced that there's something really powerful about seeing someone else who's gone through the transformation talk about their own transformation so that it's possible more than any expert could ever convince you, right? But then also, like you're saying, there's some like this collective power of intention to support everyone else and on there to know that other people that you've never met have your back. So I'd love to, just talk about why you think the power of 8 is so important. And, obviously this is happening with other sizes, but, 8 is an interesting number, and I'm sure there's a reason why you chose it.
Well, I'm wearing 8 right now.
I see that. I like your pendant.
I mean, it means infinity, of course. It's a lovely, just turn it on its side and it's infinity. But to be honest, James, it came about, it was a happy, happy accident, just as I described it earlier, of just saying, hey, yeah, we'll put them in groups of 8. And my husband says, yeah, power of 8. I like that. It was a happy accident. I had people in groups that have been different numbers? Yes. I've had 7, I've had 9, I've had 12. I think that there is probably a nice optimum size. And I think when you get smaller than about 5, it's not really a group. It's a couple of individuals.
Yeah.
I think if you get more than 12 myself, I've started seeing that as unwieldy for a group that are all holding hands and praying together, essentially. They're all intending together. So you start getting a big, large group, and that becomes a little unwieldy. So 8 is really maybe an optimum number, but I haven't looked at any sacred geometry or any reasons for the 8. I haven't looked at, ancient ideas about it. Just the idea of that coming together collectively and intending together is powerful. But the biggest powerful part of it is, and here's the new piece, this is the thing that turns it all on its head, not intending for yourself, intending for someone else.
Boom. I love that.
That's the big new piece.
Yeah.
And I have seen that over and over again. The successes aren't just with the attendees, the recipients. so many healing intentions occur among the people doing the sending. And I started looking at that. I'll give you the story of a guy called Wes. He is a Vietnam vet. He was supposed to go to college, to university. And in his senior year, he went, and his senior year, he got pulled out. He had a low lottery number. And so he had to go his senior year of high school. So he had to go off to fight this war he didn't believe in. And it really messed up his head. He came back depressed. And his life kind of careened off course after that. And not much really good happened to him. Even when he met the love of his life late in the 90s, later in his life, he had a few good years with her. She died of cancer. He had huge medical bills. I mean, it was just an awful story. So he was in a Power of 8 group of mine, and he wasn't even the subject. And he came back a couple of days later and said, "That was unbelievable. I have somehow recovered the joy in my life, the purpose of my life, things that were impossible for me to do." I mean, he'd got to a point of just being so depressed. It was sort of, what's the use in even doing anything? And even making dinner for himself was a chore. And he'd sort of rediscovered some big purpose. So when I started investigating why is altruism so powerful, I came across so many studies of altruism. And absolutely, as I said before, bulletproof vest. The people who do for someone else live long, if any way, live longer, are healthier. If they have a condition and they're helping somebody else with the same condition, they do better. Very interesting study of prayer by a psychologist and priest who wanted to see whether or not prayer could do anything for people with depression. So he got about 400 plus volunteers, put them in 2 groups, and one group were the people to be prayed for, and the other group were the people doing the praying. And he found that afterward, when he calculated the results, the people who got prayed for, they were doing better, no question, but not anywhere near as good as the people who had done the praying. So just substitute intention, because we're just talking about very focused. Intention is not asking, your higher maker to, thy will be done. Intention is like a very specific request to the universe, but done in a group together and done for someone else over and over, I find it is strengthening. And it is probably the most powerful thing in my year-long groups. When people are stuck, I oftentimes say to them, if they're not getting well, if their life isn't moving, get off of yourself. Start intending for someone else and see what happens. And absolutely, it works so amazingly.
That's
and of
awesome.
Course, go ahead. And yeah, of course, there's the whole issue too of how it works. I've spoken with Deckard Keltner, who is a psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley, and he talks about that vagus nerve, that love nerve, and how it activates the immune system, and it becomes a virtuous circle of keep going and keep activating. So I think that's a piece that always gets ignored, particularly in our self-help movement. It needs to be not self-help. It needs to be other help.
Yeah, other help. I love that difference there. It's interesting when you talk about the mechanism, because I think I've had a conversation with Mark Hyman, who's doing amazing work with functional medicine, and he was like, look, the mechanism of how good food affects good health is so complex, right? Just think of all the different nutrients and how they affect all the different, cells and the methylation pathways. And it's so complex that we may never be able to fully understand the interaction between genes and the environment at such a low level for the food. However, what we can do is look at it from a meta-analysis and go, hey, if we do a controlled experiment, do we see that, a food as medicine approach will deliver better outcomes at lower cost, right? And that's what they're doing at the Cleveland Clinic, these outcome studies, because he was like, look, as long as we're just down the rabbit hole of mechanism, we're just going to be playing a losing game, because the human body is infinitely complex. And all the time we're learning about these more and more complex mechanisms, and it's bioenergetic, and it's, it's biochemical, but we will never be able to distill it down to the, the parts that make it up. And so let's just talk about, the costs. And so, I'd love to just talk, because you're listening here, like, this podcast is typically for, for doctors in our community and health professionals. But I think with this one, we're going to send it out to our, patient list too, because obviously it sounds like anyone can start to take advantage of this. And I imagine in the book, you got some starting points on how people can sort of self-organize in these groups. Because, one of the things about the internet, it used to be difficult to find people who are on your wavelength, in your area, because you just have to like knock on doors or show up at different events. But now the internet sort of provides an opportunity for people who want to get involved with this kind of stuff to do it, and people to organize it. So what are some ways that the average person who's listening to this, whatever role they're playing in medicine, whether it's as like an end user, a supporter, or an intender, they want to help other people, they want to help themselves, they want to help themselves by helping other people, or they're in a job of serving other people as some sort of health professional. What are some of the ways that we can really start to activate the power of 8 in our communities?
Well, as you said, it used to be the case that you had to, grab your church group or find your neighbors. Now, you still can. I mean, if you do have a church group, ask 8 of your like-minded friends to come together and meet with you regularly. And it doesn't have to be meeting in person. Or if you have a book group, or if you have belonged to any groups, virtual groups, or you can join my community, because we can set you up in groups of 8 and just be virtual. For doctors or health professionals, I think this is a brilliant thing for people to do in terms of patients. I mean, when I was pregnant with my first child, I was working with, my obstetrician was a brilliant natural birth specialist, a real pioneer in the UK. And he used to have Wednesdays where all the women who were pregnant would come, all of his patients would come together who were going to have babies or had just had their babies, and we'd meet. And we'd have lunch, and we'd have a talk, and we'd do yoga together, and we'd hold each other's babies. And it became, I still have lifelong friends, but it became almost like a power of 25, where we were working together and we all got over fear. That group was not frightened of having babies, because we kind of created this virtuous circle. And I think you can do the same. If you have a patient body, just inviting some of them to come together on Monday nights or something like that and intend for each other. First of all, the patient isn't alone. They're not alone with their illness anymore. They get off of themselves, and they have that support of that group. So anyone can do that. Doctors are so lonely these days, because they're up against, if they're doing something new in medicine, they're up against the entrenched establishment. Getting them together, there's nothing woo-woo about just coming together and doing a little intention for the healing of a patient, for their stress, the lowering of their stress, because doctors go through an enormous amount of stress. So there's ways for everybody to bring it in their lives. And I'll just mention too, James, that if this is being shown before September 30th, I'm running a giant American peace intention experiment that's happening September 30th to October 5th. And it is on Gaia TV. It's AmericanIntentionExperiment.com. Free to sign up. It's no cost involved. It's little half-hour broadcasts about the power of 8, but also in the middle of all of it is a giant intention experiment. Now, there's 2 reasons. We're going to focus on a really violent part of America. And of course, we have a team of scientists who are going to measure this. But there's a bigger reason I'm doing this, which is I have found with these big intention experiments, there are also enormous rebound effects. And people who do intention for peace, their lives seem to become more peaceful. I've had a lot of people get healed by being part of something big like this. I've surveyed people, again, trying to take a scientific view of it, and surveyed people after all our big experiments. So doing big experiments too, doctors just trying to do a little intention experiment among their patient body. It's not beyond, imagination to do something like that. Yeah. But also taking part of this whole idea of being part of something bigger, doing something altruistic, that's the real thing that's happening here. That's That's the healing mechanism.
Beautiful. Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And Lynn, I don't know if you know exactly what we've been up to for the last 4 years, but it's literally putting doctors and health practitioners into groups and coordinating that, because I knew this, and it wasn't that I knew it, but I knew it. You know what I mean? It's like I always knew it, and I knew that's what we need to do. The Functional Forum started with a meetup in New York. We started hearing about these other meetups getting together to watch the show, and now we've got 500, and we're really growing, because you're so right. It's like the isolation is the biggest issue when doctors try and do something different, or health professionals, feel weird. But you put them in a group together, they start, getting some momentum to themselves, and suddenly, I think what's happening generally is that our world is having to make the jump from being the weird kids to being the cool kids, because we're actually good at reversing chronic disease and no one else knows how to do it. And it's the biggest problem on the planet. And so, we've been, helping to facilitate this. And I think there's a certain confidence that comes from being a part of that group. And then, once you have that group energy and you have a, good group of people together, then you can decide what you want to do with that. Like, one of the things that we've really focused on is decentralized decision-making. We're not here to tell you what to do with your group. We're just here to help facilitate the creation of that group. And then we'll give you some ideas about what you might be able to do. But I'm really excited to send this podcast into the ether, because I feel like hopefully everyone who's listening to this will have just a different kind of idea of what they want to try or what's possible. And the biggest thing that you said is that the value actually accrues to the person who's doing the intending on other people. And that's really, really powerful, because I think it creates the right structure for everyone to participate fully.
Well, that was the thing that's so interesting. I mean, I started finding this out. Again, I had, these groups were my petri dish. I was starting to practice with things. And there were a number of people who just weren't getting better, or their lives weren't improving. And one of them was Andy. Andy was recently divorced, and she had sold her gift shop. So she didn't have steady income. She wanted a new career, and nothing was coming along no matter what she was trying to do. And so I finally just said, I was trying all kinds of stuff in calls and things during this year, and said, okay, just get off of yourself. I have somebody else for you to attend to who needs this more than you. And that somebody was a kid called Luke, who had broken up. He was 15. His father wrote to me, and he'd broken up with his first girlfriend. And in a fit of existential adolescent angst, he'd taken himself and thrown himself off a 40-foot structure onto hard ground. So and all the doctors listening know that every bone in his body was broken. It was a miracle he was still alive. He had brain damage. He had nerve damage. It was a mess. And the doctors didn't think he was going to live. So our group set up a little healing vigil for Luke, where we intended for him in 3 separate occasions. And the parents kept a running commentary, and they noted times of intention and what happened to him. And his mood would change drastically right afterward. And also, he healed in record time. He healed and he healed in record time. Now, that could have been good doctoring. I'm not going to say, yeah, we definitely did it. But a real interesting thing happened in the groups. A number of the people who had been completely stuck had amazing, miraculous things happen to them that following week, whether it was their health improving, or in Andy's case, out of nowhere, she got a call and a dream job offer. Now, maybe that was coincidence, but it happened over and over and over again. There's something amazing about this, just getting off of yourself. By the way, in Luke's case, for anyone who believes this was a placebo effect, it couldn't have been. That was one good thing about Luke, because like most 15-year-olds, he thought his parents' belief in the power of intention was pretty stupid.
I can resonate with that. I have a mother who I think has been talking about all this kind of stuff my whole life, but I'm getting into it. That's great. Well, look, Lynn, I really appreciate you coming on here and spending the time. I'd encourage anyone who's watching to grab the book. Think about, starting a community, starting a group. You can always start a Functional Forum meetup group and bring practitioners together. But I'm even more excited right now to start, what you said also about the internet. I'm excited to see, we've seen some examples of, sort of root cause psychiatry delivered for the masses through like a video Skype kind of like this or Zoom. And so, you know, there's lots of different ways to do it. We've seen some examples, but it's even, you know, got me excited to sort of double and triple down on this idea of community, because we, you know, whether it's the social stress or whether it's other ways, whatever the mechanism is, there's something really valuable about getting people together and working in it. So I want to salute you for the pioneering work, also for bringing something really tangible to the world. You know, I think that this is something that everyone can just grab, you know, put their teeth into and get going. Thank you for your continuing work with What Doctors Don't Tell You. Very excited to see, you know, after all these years, the momentum is palpable, and look forward to, you know, to crossing paths again.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, James.
This is James Maskell, your host. This is the Evolution of Medicine podcast. I've been here with Lynne McTaggart. Her new book is called The Power of 8. Make sure to check it out. I got it for my whole team at work, and we've been studying it. So you'll see how the power of us intending with our momentum in the next quarter. But thanks so much for being part of it. And we'll see you next time.